actually false advertising. The panel is about the first 100 days of Trump. I'm told that this is actually the 99th day. So who knows what will happen for the next 24 hours. I'm a little concerned that we may not have much to talk about. My name is Dave Campbell, and I am the director of the Notre Dame Democracy Initiative. The Democracy Initiative envisions Notre Dame as a trusted institution that people turn to for studying and for strengthening democracy. This is one in our signature event series known as Democracy Talks, which offer accessible, engaging opportunities for all in the Notre Dame community to better understand current events, what's going on in the world. I'd like to thank Al and Mary Hardy for their support of the Democracy Talk series. Should also acknowledge the institutes and centers that are represented here. They've also provided support. That includes the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, and the Notre Dame International Security Center. Tonight, we will spend a few minutes talking about the first 99 days of the second Trump that tells us about the nature of the presidency, the state of the nation, the role of America in the world. Or we could talk about the Canadian election, which is happening right now. Dealer's choice. We'll go. Let me begin by introducing our moderator, Christina Wolbrecht, who on title. She is a professor of political science, and she is the C. Robert and Margaret Hanley, family director of the Notre Dame Washington program, but also known to many of us as the Stellar Scholar. And she will be, as I said, moderating today's discussion. At the far end, we have Matthew Hall, the David A. Potenziani Memorial College Professor of Constitutional Studies and the director of the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy, also well-known scholar and instructor. Next to him, we have Michael Desch, who is the Packard J.D. Professor of Political Science, and the Brian and Janelle Brady Family Director of NDISC, the Notre Dame International Security Center. Next to him, we have Aníbal Pérez-Liñán, also Professor of Political Science, also Professor of Global Affairs, and the Director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. And I hope you got all that, because there will be a quiz. I will turn things over to Professor Wolbrecht to kick us off, but please welcome our panel as they help us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I think we're going to have a very fruitful discussion here. We've got scholars really covering multiple aspects of what this second first 100 days of Donald Trump has looked like, and so I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I've been told that even though I'm the monitor or the moderator, also a monitor. So let's see if I get have any time or any questions. So I wanted to start by just setting the stage. So this whole concept of the first 100 days dates to the first presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected in 1932 and took office in March of 1933. Used to make people wait even longer than they do now to become president. Roosevelt, of course, becomes president during the Great Depression. There is incredibly high unemployment, economic collapse around the world, all sorts of concerns about people's everyday needs. And Roosevelt, as a campaigner, former governor of New York, promises a New Deal for the Americans, right, very famously, and promises that the Democratic administration, Democrats have been the minority party forever, but a Democratic administration was going to address the problems, bring real help to the Americans. And so when Roosevelt becomes president in March of 1933, he called a special session of Congress. He brings Congress together for a 3-month session, which lasted, yes, about 100 days. in which he proposes sort of a range of legislation. And so first I want to emphasize this idea of promises, right? He promised bold action. Then I want to sort of emphasize how extraordinary the things were that Roosevelt did, and I should say Roosevelt and Congress, that he had a Democratic Congress, overwhelmingly a Democratic Congress, do not be the party in power during the Great Depression. That is my political advice to all of you. That's how you get the other party in power. So made these great promises and then takes extraordinary action. So Congress in this 100-day period passes laws, many of them very important, having to do with banking, the regulation of the economy, agricultural price supports. I have my list, but I'm not going to look at it. Putting people to work, all sorts of government programs to provide employment for Americans, et cetera. 15 major pieces of legislation, and something like 35 altogether of sort of bills that made dramatic changes to, again, how we regulate banking, how we treat the agricultural markets, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to this, Franklin Roosevelt issued what was for the time the record, and a record that stood until just about a month ago, the most executive orders in the first 100 days that any president has ever issued. Donald Trump is now eating up that particular record, right? Executive orders are also a sort of extraordinary way in which presidents direct agencies and offices under the executive branch to go about their business. Big promises, extraordinary action, enormous consequence. So Roosevelt, of course, served more than 100 days. He served almost 4 years. Okay. But his presidency, and in particular, the bills and things that were first started during his first 100 days, transformed American politics. Government came to regulate and manage things it had never been involved in before. We became a global superpower. World War II is going to help with that. We expanded the size of it and the scope of government. Our expectations for how governments would manage things like economic downturns, like banks, like agricultural prices, would never be the same, right? One of the most consequential presidents in America. Also true that much of what he did was controversial. Some of those first decisions were challenged in the court and overturned by courts. Certainly, there were many Republicans in particular that felt that this was a dramatic overreach on Franklin Roosevelt's part, and sort of fighting over the New Deal really defined our politics for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And frankly, probably still to this day. And so we have this model of sort of big promises, extraordinary actions, and major consequences. I'm going to ask these guys about extraordinary actions in just a second. I want to talk a little bit about thinking about Trump in terms of big promise. So I think it's fair to say that nothing that Trump has done so far, in particular, should have surprised anyone given his impact. While President Trump did publicly disavow Project 2025 put together by the Heritage Foundation, he did run on something that got a lot less coverage, Agenda 47, where he laid out and very publicly said, these are the things I'm going to do. If you want to Google that later, it's going to sound a lot like Project 2025. It's going to talk about deporting millions of people, and it's going to talk about stopping universities from being leftist, whatever we are. It's going to sound very normal. And so, like Roosevelt, Trump came in promising to do big and dramatic things and to remake the United States in what he understood to be a better way. It has taken extraordinary actions for Trump to do these things. And so my first question to my panelists from their areas of expertise is, what has been literally extraordinary, unusual, not seen before in the first 199 days of this second Trump administration? And I'll start with, I got the mic before.
Thank you, Christina. Well, if I think what is for me, I'm a comparativist. I was born in Latin America, in Argentina, and I've studied the presidency in comparative perspective for a long time. And for me, what is extraordinary about the Trump administration is how ordinary the U.S. has become as a country, right? In the history of the U.S. presidency, when people thought about American exceptionalism, right, what appeared to be the foundation of American exceptionalism was the strength of American political institutions, the strength of constitutional rules. And the implication of that was that when you have a very strong judiciary, a very strong Congress, by contrast, the president is a relatively weak political actor. And so in the 1960s, right, Richard Neustadt, a very famous study of the American presidency, could say, well, the power of the American president is not the constitutional power, really. The power of the presidency is the power to persuade, right? By contrast, right, for people studying historically the presidency in other presidential countries, like mostly Latin American countries or African countries, the possibility of executives, of presidents ruling unilaterally and kind of stretching their constitutional powers, abusing their constitutional powers, was always a present risk, right? A present possibility. So, for example, in the 1990s, Guillermo O'Donnell, who was the first academic director of the Kellogg Institute, developed this concept of delegative democracy that was very influential. And the idea of delegative democracy was that it was a type of democracy in which whoever is elected president, right, he said, can rule however he or she sees fit to the extent, but there was this condition, to the extent that existing power relations allow, right? And when you think about the description of delegative democracy, which was used to describe the way in which presidents ruled in Brazil, in Argentina in the 1990s, in Peru, when you think about the description, it sounds very much like the first 100 days of the Trump administration, sorry, the first 99 days of the Trump administration, right? In the sense that it's an administration that rules unilaterally, right? We're talking about almost 140 executive orders, tends to rule by decree, like those Latin American presidents that Donald was describing, and that has stretched and pushed the use of executive authority in a way, sometimes with the implicit consent of Congress, sometimes defying the power of the judiciary, right? And so this form of government that appears to be, in a way, surprising, shocking in the US was a very common form of government in Latin America, and not everywhere, right? But so and I think that when you see the implications of that in Latin America, is that, and I think this is the main lesson that I would extract from that historical experience, is that one of the big challenges is that once you empower the executive and you accept that the executive rules unilaterally by decree, then when that genie is out of the bottle, it's very hard to put back in the bottle, right? The ability of executives to rule unilaterally is something that it doesn't serve any specific political party. It's going to serve any executive that comes to power in the future. And so I think that's the key tricky issue that the Latin American experience teaches us.
Mike.
Thanks, Christina. Glad to be here with my colleagues, and very timely topic. I hope we'll come back to Aníbal's point about the United States becoming an ordinary country, because I think that's happening. The big debate is sort of why, and was there ever any way for us not eventually to sort of regress to the mean? But I was going to take Christina's question about extraordinary elements of the first 100 days in a little bit different direction. I think what's extraordinary for me is how President Trump has managed to take issues that are serious and that I think could be topics of serious debate and make them seem crazy. frankly. So three I had in mind. One is the disestablishment of USAID. Now, whether we needed USAID or the responsibilities of it should have been folded into the State Department, I think is a reasonable issue. AID has now three missions. The first mission, the original mission, and the most important, is relief. There's a disaster, if there's a famine and things like that, we should have a mechanism for responding to that. Two other missions, though, that AID has developed in or taken on in recent years, I think reasonable people can differ about. The second mission is development, and there's a long debate, and I'm in the nest of comparativists, so I want to be humble about what I say about development, which is more your purview than mine, Aníbal. But I would just say anybody who's read former World Bank economist William Easterly's book, The Elusive Quest for Growth, would have grounds for questioning whether the sort of modal development policies that the World Bank and the United States have pursued have been effective. Now, whether they could have been done differently, I think that's a fair debate as well. The third issue, and maybe relevant to our host, the Democracy Initiative, is that in recent years, AID has become a big actor in democratization efforts. And this is an area that people in my field of international relations study. And the track record, frankly, of foreign-imposed regime change or even foreign-facilitated regime change since the beginning of the Cold War has been pretty poor. And so thinking about whether that's something the US government should be involved in and that we should have a separate agency undertaking that, I think those are all serious issues. But I think the Trump administration, in its inimitable way, has made serious discussion about that unlikely to happen. Secondly, Ukraine. This is probably not popular, but I'm going to say it. The Ukraine war, basically by the spring of 2023, was a failed undertaking. And in my opinion, every life lost since the failure of the Ukrainian June offensive has been squandered. Catholic just war theory has a number of tenets, you all know them. One of the ones we don't talk about, but which is very important, is reasonable prospect of success. Since that time, there has not been a reasonable prospect of success that Ukraine is going to win, defined in terms of reestablishing the 1991 borders. To its discredit, the West and especially the United States have ignored that fact and continued to pump weapons and money into a war that's just now killing lots of people. Now, I think that was apparent to some of us early on. I think having a debate about what we should do given that is a serious matter. But again, the current administration has really, I think, muffed that. So all of a sudden we have this not only discussion about a peace agreement for the war, but also an agreement about access to rare earth metals and other resources in Ukraine, which seems to me to be both unseemly and not in any way connected with settling that war. So in a perverse sort of way, the president's extraordinary capability to take serious issues and make them seem crazy, for me, is a defining factor of the first 100 days.
Thank you, Matt. Matt?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I think that I would say, what I'll say is very much in line with what Aníbal was saying about the United States no longer being an extraordinary country, the United States becoming an ordinary country. As an Americanist, I think I see it like I'm the fish in the water, and so I would frame it a little differently. I would say that what's extraordinary about Trump's first 99 days is that he has systematically attacked what it is to be an American. And that's a bold claim that sounds hyperbolic by definition. And so I want to make sure that I'm defining what I mean by that very clearly. A lot of politicians and activists will talk about what it means to be an American, American values, American ideals, the promise of America. We can have a lot of flapping gums about big pie in the sky ideas, but I mean something very specific when I say what it is to be an American. And that is pretty clearly defined in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And that is inclusion, freedom, and equality. For those who aren't familiar with Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, there are actually 4 clauses. The first clause is birthright citizenship. If you're born here, you're a citizen, period. End of story. I didn't say if your parents were supposed to be here, if your parents were legally here, if your parents were citizens. I didn't say anything. I said, if you pop out of the womb and land on this dirt, you're a citizen. It's magic dirt. It's that simple, right? There's a reason they wrote it that way, right? There's a reason they wrote it to be broadly inclusive. For those confused, see Civil War. But they wrote it that way very clearly and very specifically. It's never been seriously questioned in our politics. And there's now an executive order from the President of the United States nullifying birthright citizenship. And so inclusion, broad inclusion in our citizenry is under attack. The second principle, by the way, there is a second clause, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which was basically erased by the Supreme Court in the 1870s, sorry. But it is worth noting that in the Privileges and Immunities Clause, they refer to citizens. That is, they had just defined what citizens are, and they then referred to citizens. And that's really, really important. In case you were wondering if they forgot how to use the word citizens, they didn't. They could still use it. And then when we get to the Due Process Clause, the third clause of the 14th Amendment, which ensures our freedom, they didn't use the word citizen. They used the word person. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. To take out the fancy speak, no one can be fined, thrown in jail, or executed without going through the procedure that you are owed for just standing on this dirt. The dirt's magical in 2 ways, right? Just standing on this dirt. We cannot do that. We cannot punish you without going through that process. And of course, the most basic part of due process, the most basic part of the process that you are owed is habeas corpus. Just get into a courtroom. Habeas corpus is Latin for show me the body. Literally, it's a court saying you're holding someone in prison, bring him and prove to me that that's okay. By abducting, I'm afraid I have to use the word abducting because arrest is a legal term, which begins a legal process. I'm afraid I cannot accurately use the term arrest. By abducting persons standing on this dirt without bringing them to a court, we are fundamentally attacking the most basic rule that establishes freedom. There's a lot of jabber about freedom, right? We're the land of the free. We love our freedom. That's due process sounds fancy and distant. It is the functional meaning of freedom in our country. And it is being openly flouted while the Supreme Court shakes their fists uselessly. It is being openly ignored. And finally, and this is a little less direct, I don't think we've seen this quite as clearly, but equality is that third core principle of what it is to be an American. The fourth clause of the Section 1 is the Equal Protection Clause. No person shall, again, they use person, in case you were thinking only citizens are treated equally. No person shall be denied the equal protection of the laws. And that means that our laws apply to everyone equally, regardless of what group we can assign you to, regardless if you're a citizen or a non-citizen, regardless if you're here legally or not here legally, regardless if you're a gang member or whatever other label we want to put on you, a terrorist, or we can come up with all sorts of negative labels. It doesn't matter. The law applies to everyone equally, and we are seeing very systematically the executive branch assert, no, it doesn't. And so to me, that is when I just sit down and think, what is it to be an American, to be inclusive, to be free, and to be equal? Is that what it means to be an American today? We're going to have a debate.
Thank you. So we talked about what's extraordinary. I want to also talk about consequences. So we are only, miracle of all miracles, 99 days into this administration. And even while we're talking, I'm sure something will happen that we didn't expect or didn't know about. But I guess this is our sort of first chance to think about history. What do we think will be, if the Trump administration ended tomorrow, what would be the long-term consequences of this past 99 days? So I'll start with Mike about thinking about maybe the position of the US in the world. What does this all mean?
President Trump feels he has extraordinary agency, so I'm sure he thinks even if he only has 100 days in office, that he'll have a great impact on the world. I guess my view is a little bit different. I think that he certainly could have an important impact on the world in terms of decisions he might make, particularly about going to war, maybe against Iran, maybe in the context of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But I don't know that anything he's done short of that is going to be something that, the Christina Wolbrecht III in a generation is going to talk about impactful decisions. I guess for me, the more interesting question is how much agency does Trump have, and how much is he a reflection of changes in the world and in our country? And that's why I was so quick to hop on Aníbal's point about America becoming a normal state, because we haven't been a normal state for a long time. And I think it was both inevitable we would become a normal state, and also, in a way, I think our period of being an extraordinary state was a mixed period. We did some really good things. We also did some really dumb things. We're coming up on another anniversary of the war in Vietnam, which is, in the Cold War period, a classic example of a dumb thing that we did, thinking of ourselves as being somehow extraordinary. Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, called us the indispensable nation. And we've long thought of ourselves as indispensable, and in some instances we were, but we can't always be. And sometimes trying to play that role can put us in a position where things go awry. I guess the other thing I would ask is, hasn't there long been a disconnect between our own image of Americans, of where we are in the world, and what big parts of the rest of the world think about us? And I think the gap has long been big. Now, part of it is, anytime you have such an overwhelmingly powerful country as the United States, particularly after the end of the Cold War, it's going to invite some criticism. But again, I think that also taking the opportunity to ask ourselves what life as an ordinary country would be like is something that could be healthy for our country. So what's all this got to do with Trump? I think he's done a lot of dumb things. I fear he will do a lot more dumb things. But I also see the history of the past quarter of the century of a long line of American administrations doing dumb things as well. Maybe the problem is deeper than just one individual administration.
I'm gonna turn to Matt next, but flow of this is Aníbal. Sorry.
Consequences. I think that there's some immediate consequences of what we have, decisions that we have seen over the past 99 days, like the dismantling of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development that Mike was mentioning. And then I think there are more long-term consequences that I feel have to do with demonstration effects for other countries, right? So for example, if you think about the dismantling of USAID, that's something that has very serious consequences in the short run. I think only now, some people are estimating the real impact in terms of human lives and things like that. Even some colleagues here in the biology department. But so, for example, some colleagues in USAID provided, as Mike was explaining, right, lots of funding relief for development, for global health, and so on. So some colleagues at Oxford have estimated that the dismantling of 8 programs in sub-Saharan Africa, the expectation of that is that the cutting of funding for those programs means that potentially within the next 5 years, 500,000 children could be dying from AIDS. Right now, almost more than 2 million children would be orphaned as a result of AIDS. It is estimated some tropical diseases that are carried by mosquitoes and other vectors, and if you don't control the vector, they spread pretty quickly. So it is calculated that calculations are hard, but about 100,000 people may die from malaria every year as a result of the cutting aid, right? About 2 million people in Afghanistan are not receiving food and health assistance. 80% of the community kitchens in Sudan have shut down as a result of the dismantling of USAID. So that potentially puts millions of people at the risk of starvation. So even though in terms of the US, relative to the total US budget of the US government, USAID was a very small percent of the budget, the consequences for human lives across the world are huge. Now, these are only the immediate effects, right? Over the long run, part of my concern is that Trump is a very powerful figure as a president who produces a very strong demonstration effect across the world. And I think that his style is legitimizing and empowering kind of strongman politics throughout the world. Right? I can imagine how in many other countries, presidents now want to be like Trump. Right? Before, presidents were constrained to some extent by US policies, right? And so there were some things that they attempted to do, and US foreign policy would curtail those actions. For example, when President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil lost the election in 2022, right, he conspired with military officers to plot a military coup to overthrow the incoming government. As far as we know, the military were kind of on the fence, right? The Navy was willing to go ahead. Part of the other armed forces were uncertain because they thought it was kind of a crazy thing. The message of US public officials was, you cannot do that. And so that kind of dissuaded part of the military coalition to jump on board. My concern is that over the long run, the demonstration effects of the US model now will legitimize and empower some sort of strongman politics in many countries in which this is only a possibility now.
Thank you. Matt?
I don't like to make predictions. I think that asking a political scientist to make predictions about politics is a lot like asking a zoologist to make predictions of who will win the Kentucky Derby. Seems like there's a relationship there, but no, it's really no use at all. I will say that I'm a big believer that I don't know what'll happen, but I tend to not agree that the critical question is whether or not our institutions hold. I think a lot of people talk about this as, will the Supreme Court hold? Will Congress hold? What happens? Will state and local governments hold? What happens when courts are ignored? I actually do not think that is the critical question. I'm a big fan of a quote by a famous Court of Appeals judge from the DC Circuit in the early 20th century, whose name, I am not joking, was Judge Learned Hand. Judge Hand, his parents thought he was going to be a janitor, but he turned out to be a judge. Judge Hand said once that when liberty dies in the hearts of men and women, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. When it lives in the hearts of men and women, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it. This is going to play out more, I believe, in the hearts of men and women. And that's where I totally agree with Mike that it was always inevitable that the United States could not forever be a unique, exceptional country. But I think the question was, were we going to become more like the rest of the world, or was the rest of the world going to become more like us? And I think for a long time, there was a lot of arguments to be made that the rest of the world was looking more like us, more democratic, more capitalist, more pluralistic. There were more Coca-Cola bottles and McDonald's burgers. And I think now it's looking like it's going the other way. And I think that this fight will happen not just in the US public, but in publics across Europe and South America and the Far East. There's a lot of public debate yet to be had on which way the world will be going.
Thank you. I will say, and I know all three of the people up here know this as well, I do think when we talk about it was inevitable that American democracy would crumble in certain sorts of ways. We don't want to forget that American democracy has a very checkered past as well. So throughout the very late 19th century and through the middle of the 20th century, the American South, for example, was an autocratic authoritarian state where democracy was not really functioning in any way, shape, or form, which is both a reality, but of course also a hope in the sense that there have been changes to these.
It's better to think of American democracy as starting around 1964, 1965.
Right, and maybe ending around 2013. But yeah, anyway, nonetheless, this is why they have me moderate and not speak. So I want to make sure we have time for audience questions, so start thinking about those. We're going to have microphones. If you're an undergraduate, we're going to pick on you first. But I'm going to do one more quick round. So this is the short one. Everybody gets their own question. Matt no longer gets to go last. Hey, Matt, where's Congress? What's happening with checks and balances?
Checks and balances is a concept that suggests that the branches disagree. Congress is on board.
There you go.
That's where Congress is. The court is in big trouble because apparently the president is willing to say we can ignore you. And I wrote a book about this. And when the president or when any executive says we're just going to ignore you, that actually works in a lot of situations. The one situation when it doesn't work, the one situation when the Supreme Court can go against public opinion and go against executive is letting people out of jail to change society. You want to have abortion in society? Well, we'll stop convicting the abortionists. And all of a sudden, society changes. And they can even go against public opinion. That's assuming that you're using US jails, not prisons in El Salvador. So I don't even know if it can do that anymore.
Fair enough, fair enough. Mike, I think you've already sort of answered this. Maybe help us understand what's going on in the Department of State right now, Signalgate, all these sorts of things. How should we understand what sort of matters? And by looking at things like Signal, are we missing important things that are happening in the State Department?
Well, the Signalgate was Department of Defense, which is in a period of profound chaos and President Trump has responsibility for that because he appointed the Secretary of Defense, who was not a very good manager. In one sense, the Signalgate thing was a bit overdone because these weren't war plans that were being signaled around among a group of high-level officials and also a prominent reporter from the Atlantic. But it's important because we live in a government national security advisor environment in which there's a lot of overclassification of stuff that doesn't need to be classified. But the reality is it is classified, and if you were not the Secretary of Defense or the National Security Advisor, but you were a colonel in military intelligence and you blabbed like this, your career would be over and you might be in the can. And that is corrosive because if it looks like at the highest levels of the institution that a different set of regulations apply, whether you think that they're right or not, it's bad for good order and discipline. And so I do think, I was maybe sounded a little bit cavalier about, some of the issues where the Trump administration had behaved very ham-handedly, even though, I thought there was more substance to the issue than that had been given credit to it. But I do think that the behavior of the top leaders, including the president, matters. And why President Trump thinks that tweeting sort of from the hip is a good thing, I don't know. Why he says a lot of the stuff he says, again, apparently without much thought, I don't think is a good thing. And so, I do think that style does matter. But I think it only matters to a certain extent because you can think of cases where sensible people in our political system have done very crazy things. So David Halberstam's book about Vietnam, The Best and the Brightest, McGeorge Bundy, Walt Rostow, a lot of really smart people did absolutely dumb things. Think about Joe Biden, very sensible guy, good president, I think, overall. But think about his policy towards Gaza, a issue that began on his watch. And with all the reasonableness that he had, the fact of the matter is a huge humanitarian crisis took place, perpetrated in part by one of our allies with our financial and military support. So we're in a weird world where sensible people are doing not only dumb things, but in some cases, evil things. And then we've got crazy people who may do not only dumb, but evil things. That, it seems to me, is the pickle that we're in. If it were just, crazy people, we could wait out 3 years and go back to business as usual. But I think there are a lot of people who think business as usual for the past 25 or 30 years hasn't been all that good. So I don't know. It's dyspeptic, but it's the end of the semester. What can I say?
And then
Only at the end do I remember my mic. Aníbal, I wanted to ask, one thing we haven't talked about is sort of the civil society response to Trump. And I guess asking you as someone who's thought comparatively about these, and especially other sort of presidential systems that have gone awry, how do we sort of evaluate the American public's response to Trump? And how does this compare to, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary or Bolsonaro in Brazil, et cetera?
No. So Bolsonaro is a slightly different case. Let's say Viktor Orban in Hungary, he was historically much more popular than Trump, right? He was in the 70-60% approval rates. Now he's around the same level of approval, I think, but than President Trump, but he's in his fourth term, right, in office. So a long time and an erosion for his approval. And so now, in terms of civil society mobilization, that's always crucial, right? Because it signals politicians that there is a society that is opposing some actions that they perceive as anti-democratic or against the Constitution. And politicians always need to see that there is public support if they are going to take the risk of confronting a powerful executive. Sometimes civil society mobilization is the only recourse after institutions are not able to contain the executive anymore, right? That's not the case in the US now. But I must say, I think we have all perceived in the US that in the first Trump administration, there was a lot of initial mobilization and kind of enthusiasm about opposing the administration. And then in the second term, there was of course, excitement among people who support the administration, but among people who oppose the administration, there was some sort of collective depression and less willingness to mobilize. And I think that's not surprising, right? I think we have seen that in other countries. What I found distinctive and honestly quite concerning in the US, in civil society in the US now, that they have never seen before, is the fact that I've seen a society that is much more scared than I had seen ever in the past, right? So you perceive, of course, fear among immigrants that they may be deported or students that their visas may be canceled. But you also see fear among powerful law firms that they may be targeted by the executive and they may be blocked from access government sources or businesses. You see fear among universities that their funding will be cut. So you see, of course, fear among public servants that they will be fired without or suspended or put on temporary leave without clear reason. So there is I think there is a sense of collective fear in many parts of societies that were very uncommon in the US. Right? I had never perceived something like that, and I think in many other countries it's something that is quite common. It seems to me that society has been very, in part because the US society is not used to that kind of situation, how to respond has been very uncertain. And so most institutions initially, and people, I think, initially had responded by trying to lay low or try to negotiate with the executive when they can individually, right, to try to avoid being targets. And something similar has happened with countries, right, that suffer tariffs and so on. I think it's only now that important sectors of society and important institutions are realizing that without collective action, the executive is always in power, right? And so I think civil society mobilization is going to be very important to the extent that collective action sends the signal that society is not willing to tolerate actions beyond the Constitution.
That's really useful. Thank you. All right, folks, what do you want to hear us talk about? Denise very kindly is running the mic. And again, as I said, we'll start with some undergraduate questions.
Hi there. Thank you very much for coming and speaking. I had a question. Sorry, I'm terrible with names. Is it Matt over here on this? Hi there. So
I've not been saying this.
I apologize, Professor Hall. So I was just curious. In your the first time you spoke, you brought up your 3 points. I believe the first one was inclusion, right?
Yep.
And you talked about Trump's executive order regarding birthright citizenship. And I'm sort of trying to evaluate my position on that. And of course, on one end of the political spectrum, there's that, it violates the 14th Amendment. And then I've also heard on other ends of the spectrum that as of right now, there's an abuse of birthright citizenship and what the founders, or not the founders, but what
Framers of the 14th Amendment.
Yes,
John
framers of the
Bingham, not.
meant when they
not-
wrote it,
yeah.
as it was meant to be a way to incorporate all the previously enslaved African Americans into being citizens. And so I was just wondering if you could go over how you came to arrive at your position, if just based off the wordage of the 14th Amendment, other case precedents, or just any historical examples.
Sure. So I'd say a few things. The first is the question of, do we like the idea of birthright citizenship? All right, so it might be that, yes, that is the rule, and that's what it pretty clearly says is the rule. If you just read the text, that's what the Supreme Court has always said. No court has ever disagreed. But you might think, yeah, but I don't like that rule. And so the first question is, do we live in a government of laws or not? And if you believe we live in a government of laws and you think birthright citizenship is a bad idea, or that we should get rid of it because it's being abused or something like that, by all means, propose a constitutional amendment to abolish birthright citizenship and we'll take a vote. If you believe that we live in a world where the President of the United States should be able to say, but that part of the Constitution is being abused or doesn't make sense anymore, or is being, then you don't believe in a rule of law. You believe in the rule of a man, one man, the president, whoever's president at the time. And so totally separate from whether or not you like birthright citizenship or whether it's being abused. I want everyone to be concerned about the President of the United States declaring, I get to ignore any part of the Constitution I want, because I promise you there will come a time when a president picks a part of the Constitution you don't want them to ignore. So the first point I want to make is it's not about the correct interpretation of the law, and it's not about whether or not the law is good. It's about, do you believe in law? The second question is, okay, but is that the correct interpretation of the law? And if that's the debate, there's a debate to be had that certainly I do not believe that the framers of the 14th Amendment, that is the members of Congress who voted on, the members of the state legislatures that ratified it in 1868, that's right. I do not believe that they sat down and thought, oh, now that we passed this rule, then illegal immigrants will get to enter the country and have babies, and then they'll be US citizens. But the same could be said for every single part of the Constitution. The framers were not magicians. They could not magically see into the future. They could not foresee every possible consequence of constitutional rules. That doesn't mean that the rules change. And that's why, and regardless though, that's how I would interpret it as a judge. Not my place, also not Donald Trump's place. Go ask the US Supreme Court. They get to interpret the Constitution. Finally, I would argue if you do lean on, but that wasn't the original intention. The original intention was to make sure that former slaves would not be denied citizenship. We were never imagining. I would go further. I would argue that the framers of the 14th Amendment weren't only thinking, boy, we don't want this specific group of people to be subjugated to second-class citizenship ever again. I think they wanted no one in this country to be subjugated to second-class citizenship. And thus, there's a lot of my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather worked on a steamship that went back and forth from Europe to the United States, and then one day just didn't get back on the boat when he was supposed to. So I shouldn't be here if the children of illegal immigrants are not supposed to be here. And I would imagine that there's a lot of that. But the framers of the 14th Amendment didn't want us playing those games. They wanted us to have a clear, bright rule. You're in or you're not in. So there's no second-class citizenship debates to go on. That's how I would interpret their original intentions. Sorry, that was a long rant.
I will say it's also worth saying that lots of people abuse lots of laws and still get to be citizens. That's, again, the point of equal protection.
And it doesn't mean they're not laws anymore.
Right.
Hi, thank you. My question's more directly to Professor Hall, but kind of relevant to all three of your respective fields. I received a notification earlier that there was a House Democrat who proposed 7 articles of impeachment against President Trump. So kind of like setting aside, kind of the preventative factors that would limit the possibility for that to actually happen, such as like, maybe members of the Republican majority who are concerned about a primary challenge or concerns that Democrats are being too impulsive. Are there examples, and if you could touch on, maybe examples within your respective fields, like has the president thus far in the first 99 days showed examples of impeachable offenses?
I'm happy for, I've talked a lot. The sad reality of our system is that an impeachable offense is what 67 senators say is an impeachable offense. And I'll tell you if he's committed an impeachable offense when they vote. And that's why it's real cute to say, well, but this is the law and Trump did this and that's technically a felony and a felony is a high crime or a misdemeanor. And therefore, we can play those games, but it'll turn on public opinion. And so, I could say that, yes, I believe that ordering the abduction of people from U.S. soil to be deported to a prison without any due process rights, I would say that's an impeachable offense, but it doesn't matter what I say. It matters what your senator says.
I'm not even going to touch that.
Something I would say in comparative perspective is that we have seen in presidential systems that increasingly, I think, legislators use the tool of impeachment as a way of making a statement, not as a way of attempting to initiate a process, a viable process against the president, right? This has happened in many other countries. Surprisingly, it happens increasingly so in the US, right, in which attempts to impeach any president of any party seem to be surprisingly common, and unfortunately. I think the institution of impeachment is a weird institution in the sense that, as Matt was pointing out, has this very strong political component, right? But at the same time, because it's, in the end, it's legislators who decide, but at the same time, it's not a vote of no confidence, which is what you have in a parliamentary system. So in a parliamentary system, the majority in parliament decides that the prime minister is not the prime minister anymore. It's a normal political process, right? You just change the government. In a presidential system, there is this idea that the presidential term is fixed, and therefore you can only remove the president if a serious offense against the Constitution was committed. But at the end of the day, it's the legislators who decide whether the serious violation has been committed. And so there is always this very complicated process by which the people vote the president in, but then you have legislators who are removing the president from office, and that inevitably creates a legitimacy crisis in the system. So impeachment is a very complicated institution for that reason.
Yeah, I will say in our own history of 200 some years of American government, it is a tool that has been used very sparsely. In part because I think historically it has been taken seriously, in part for the point that's been made here, that once you start impeaching people because you don't like them, all you have to do is lose an election and someone else is doing that, right? And so very serious. And part of the way is that it has to be considered legitimate. So we can think about, say, Watergate as this great example of how we stopped this sort of criminal activity in the White House. But the truth is that took a very long time. They got really lucky to find out about the tapes. And even then, it wasn't until the very last moment that Richard Nixon's public opinion collapsed enough that many Republicans who were going to stand by their president didn't, right? And so I agree, the Republicans in Congress don't have much of an incentive to do that now. And I don't think that, but I also think that would be true of any president of the same party. Yeah.
This question is more for Professor Desch. When you look at some of Trump's policies in terms of, not even policies, but the way that he speaks, like questioning Canada's sovereignty or sending, J.D. Vance and Elon Musk to Germany to campaign for the far-right parties, how do you think that affects our defense, right, in terms of, international deterrence and things like that, especially when you look at long-term effects if governments no longer feel that we are willing to back them no matter who the president is? Does that change, our deterrence strategy and how we interact with our allies, especially in Europe and North America?
Well, if you're asking me, are those good things? I mean, my answer is for almost all of them, no. But I think connecting them with our ability to defend ourselves, I'm not sure I see that as part of the problem. I mean, big part of the problem with the changing relationship between the United States and NATO is the Cold War is over. NATO is an institution that was designed for the European security problems, that until quite recently had gone away after 1989. It was under President Barack Obama that the pivot to Asia was announced, and that was in recognition of the fact that the main geopolitical rival for the United States in the 21st century was going to be China, not Russia. So I don't see those things as necessarily connected, which doesn't mean that the U.S. government ought to be involved in picking winners in elections. But let me let you in on a dirty secret. We've been picking winners in elections in Europe since 1946. And so, we used to do it covertly. Now we do it publicly. Go back to USAID and the democratization initiative. I'm really sensitive to Aníbal's point about the potential human cost of the AID defunding, and I think it's real. On the other hand, AID was spending a big portion of its budget in democracy promotion efforts, including paying most of the salaries of the civil servants in Ukraine. Now, maybe that's a good thing, but that was money that could have been spent on relief and other humanitarian activities. And so I'm not sure that being in that business is the right business for the United States. I wish other countries' democratic political systems, but I'm not sure that more than on the margin we can do much to ensure that. And I think a lot of times when we say we're doing things to promote democracy, sometimes we make it the situation worse than it otherwise was. Woodrow Wilson sent U.S. troops to Veracruz in 1915 in an effort to teach the Mexicans to elect good men. That didn't work out very well at that time, and I think a lot of our democratization efforts have been similarly counterproductive. We shouldn't be involved in playing politics in other people's countries, but we've been doing it all along. So if we're going to say it's a bad thing, let's recognize we've been in that business for quite some time.
Question.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Sorry. So this is merely anecdotal, so you can, question it all you want. But I recently spoke to my family who live in Ohio, and we all kind of came to the agreement that in the last couple months, we have experienced an increase in xenophobic or racist either comments or behaviors. It's not that this never happened before, right? But we have definitely agreed on like an perceived increase in the last few months. So I'm interested in understanding the potential mechanisms through which specific public policies might inadvertently or intentionally contribute to a climate where such behavior feels validated or normalized and its long effects on the American society. Yeah, thank you.
So I would say that I like to remind people that, so Christina just referenced when Richard Nixon's support collapsed and finally his public approval was so low that he was driven out of office by his members of his own party. They did his last approval rating a couple days before he resigned was something like 35%. When McCarthy was embarrassed in the Army McCarthy hearings and sort of his public support imploded, and there was no more sort of the end of the McCarthy era shepherded by his own personal embarrassment, his public support was still about 35%. When the Civil Rights Act was passed, there's always 35% of Americans that on a variety of metrics, whether we're talking about willingness to embrace corruption or racism or xenophobia, you're going to get the answer you aren't real thrilled with on a public opinion poll. That varies maybe 20 to 30 depending on what we're talking about. But periods of American culture operate in which those positions are considered perfectly normal. And then there are periods when they are not considered perfectly normal. And that's largely due to political leadership pushing members of their own party to normalize, to legitimize, or to delegitimize that kind of rhetoric. And so when you see members of a major party embracing rhetoric that we haven't heard before, you can count on not only that rhetoric being repeated, but that signaling it's okay, it's legitimate, and it's acceptable to a much broader range of people to use a much broader range of rhetoric, right? You don't have to have the president say the specific phrase or the specific sentiment to hear much worse come out of people. Once it's okay. It's the Overton window has expanded, and now those ideas that were once thought unspeakable are now speakable.
I would also add that there is good evidence to support your anecdotal experience. So since 2016, we have seen measurable changes in people's willingness to express opinions that were seen as shameful and embarrassing 20 years ago. Now, did they have those feelings all along? Did they, there's probably some of that going on, et cetera. But there is something very real about what is socially acceptable, what you think other people think. And there's a belief I might have, but I'm also surrounded by people telling me, you should rethink that belief. You should think about it a little differently. Here's some other ideas for you to think about. Rather than, I have this belief, and I'm told by the president of my party, that's a good belief. And by the way, if you hate them, they're not so great either, right? And so one of the things we know about public opinion is that it's very much elite-led. We all want to believe that we are perfectly independent human beings who process things, et cetera. And I don't want to totally dismiss that, but we're very much led by the example set for us by others. And so people who study attitudes about race, attitudes about sex, dramatic increases in the percentage of people, almost all Republicans, who say women should leave the public sphere and return to the home, right? Those attitudes do change over time. They've changed dramatically in my own lifetime, but we see that there's a very real public response to what people are hearing at the top.
And even if you go back to Trump's first term, when you think about who did Trump identify as the bad guys, the boogeyman, right? It's not Russia, it's China, it's illegal immigrants, it's Muslim radicals, it's inner city gang members, if anyone can guess what that's code for. What do they all have in common? They're not white. They're not white. Coincidence. It's coincidence.
There's someone behind you. Later, it's your turn.
Hi. Thank you guys for being here. Just had a kind of a clarifying question. A lot of individuals in the media and things kind of conflate Trump's actions with what he's doing, and I think like reasonable people can disagree about, say, birth tourism or illegal immigration, crime, inflation, et cetera. But then, particularly on the left, there's this conflation of the means by which Trump is doing things and what actions he's actually taking. And at least in November, a lot of what he aimed to do was palatable for the majority of Americans with the popular and the electoral vote. And so, like, how could you say the response from the Democrats and kind of on the Republican side, like what Trump is doing, like where is the delineation and how can we effectively separate like the means by which Trump is doing things with the actual actions he's taking?
Well, I'll start by answering that only because that was actually going to be my fourth question, but I wanted to have some, which is there's at least three categories here. There are things that Donald Trump is doing that we believe that the reasonable people believe are unconstitutional. And by reasonable people, I mean people who know the law, who know cases, who know how these things have been changed, right? That's one category of things. There are things that are illegal, maybe not unconstitutional, but again, people who know the law, know sort of how it's been executed and understood, would say that these things are illegal. And of course, there's been a lot of cases in courts who get to decide what's illegal, where they're saying you cannot just abduct someone off the street and ship them without any due process to a foreign president in El Salvador, right? The courts have been very clear about that, right? That's an illegal action. And then there are things that are maybe not unconstitutional or illegal, but some of us just might not like, right? And that's a very different question, right? Now, we can say, my gosh, we don't like it so much, we're going to go to the streets to try, we think it's that bad. It's not just, should Social Security be kind of privatized or not, right? I do think there's a difference between how much money should we spend on foreign aid? Let's have a debate about that, let's bring in experts, and I'm literally just going to eliminate entire offices that were created by Congress and funded by budgets that come out of Congress, right? And so I think one of the reasons that some of the responses have been slow is everyone's trying to figure out where these are, right? What is an actual threat? So if he does unconstitutional things and there's no punishment, then as we've said, then the law doesn't count, and that's a big existential crisis. If he does illegal things and nothing happens, that's sort of problematic too. Although again, as Mike has said, there's lots of examples in our history. Keep in mind, of course, just because it's been done in the past doesn't mean it was right or it should be done in the future, but that's an important perspective. And then if there's just policies you don't like, that's a political problem. That's a convince other people, organize your party, go to elections sort of problem. These two are not as easy to solve with elections, right? Because they're kind of operating outside of that sort of system. That's my thought, but.
I think this is a critical question because in a republic, form is substance, right? And so I think there are two fundamental issues of when we think about this problem. There's the content of the policy, right? What the government is doing, and some of those things we may like or we may not like. Some of those things may have terrible consequences, right? Maybe eliminating US aid may mean that 500,000 children will contract and die of AIDS over the next 5 years, right? But whether we think that that's terrible or not, that's a consequence of a policy that has a particular content. And then there is the way in which the government decides that policy and implements that policy, right? And to what extent, going back to Christina's point, the process that leads to that policy, whether we like it or not, is consistent with the constitutional rules. So very often, and I've seen this many times in Latin America, I know sometimes you hear that in the US nowadays, it's like people say, well, I really care about, right, the good policies for the American people, the Argentine people, the Brazilian people, whatever we are talking about. And people say, I don't really care about the formality of how you get there. I want the right policies to be done. But again, in a republic, the form is substance. And so when you violate the principles of the Constitution, going back to my initial point about concentration of power in the executive, then anybody can do it, right? And so I think it's always important to think, for me, that this is a test that they always try to do, is when I see a president, but it's usually the president, doing a policy in a very bold way that I like, and I'm like, yes. Then what I try to think is, okay, what would happen if a president of a party that I don't like used the same kind of power move, the same interpretation of the Constitution to do something that I don't like? Would I consider that a policy that I don't like but is legitimate, or would I consider that completely legitimate because the violation of constitutional principles? If your answer to that is that you would be uncomfortable, then you should probably not be supporting the policy that you do like.
Let me say two quick things about that. We have public opinion about this going back very, very far. This question about, do people care about the process or do they just care about the outcome and the policy? And historically, this has been a challenge. If you have a public that at the end is, whatever the outcome is, we don't care how you got there, exactly as Aníbal just said more clearly than I ever would, that's a problem for democratic stability because governments are going to change. And we have seen that. So President Obama, for example, in a number of ways expanded the power of the executive. Some people have gone so far to say that he left a loaded gun in the Oval Office, right, for the next president. Because whatever he did, whoever liked it, it opened up a door to other sorts of behaviors. So I don't want to say Obama, previewed everything that we've seen 16 to 20 and now 24 on, but it seems like a good idea when you're doing things that you like or the public likes, but there are important consequences. Guys, I think I have to call an end to this. Thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking our experts for their